November 333 BC, the narrow coastal strip of Issus, Cilicia, where steep mountains plunge directly into the deep sea. You are pinned between jagged cliffs and a raging ocean. Thousands of miles from home, exhausted, freezing, and staring into the abyss. Your boots sink deep into the freezing mud. Your stomach is empty. And behind the thick fog, the absolute worst has happened. Your vital supply line has just been violently severed. Europe's most invincible war machine has marched blindly into a fatal, inescapable trap. 40,000 exhausted Macedonian soldiers, staring down the absolute might of Emperor Darius and his 100,000-man war machine. Alexander is outnumbered and completely cut off. But this narrow, muddy death trap is exactly where the Emperor will break and run. Rewind 18 months. Following the bloody victory at Granicus, a relentless military storm violently swept down the Anatolian coast. The legendary fortress of Sardis surrendered immediately, Ephesus threw its gates wide open. Alexander seized massive Persian gold vaults. But the Persian Empire was a sprawling behemoth. Their invincible fleet still ruled the Mediterranean, threatening to sever Alexander's retreat completely. Outnumbered on the water, Alexander devised an unprecedented, ruthless strategy. He would use his land army to systematically suffocate the enemy navy. Capture every single coastal port. Stripped of safe harbors to restock fresh water, the Persian fleet would naturally wither and rot away. Miletus fell, but Halicarnassus fought back fiercely, mutating into a bloody meat grinder that slowly drained Alexander's precious manpower and time.
The final fortress was crushed to dust, but the absolute core of the Persian fleet managed to weigh anchor and escape. Forward momentum was his only survival. Abandoning the futile naval chase, Alexander ruthlessly plunged his army deep into the treacherous interior. The next target was Gordium, a city safeguarding an ancient sacred artifact that supposedly held the geopolitical fate of the entire continent. The Gordian Knot. An ancient prophecy foretold. Whoever unraveled this impossible puzzle would become the undisputed lord of Asia. Alexander didn't waste time solving it. One brutal stroke of cold steel shattered the rules entirely. He forged his own destiny. 333 BC. The army blitzed through the treacherous Cilician gates at terrifying speed, pitching camp in the fertile plains of Tarsus. But at Tarsus, the unstoppable march violently crashed. A flesh-burning fever nearly dragged Alexander into the underworld.
The entire campaign held its breath. Despite receiving a direct assassination warning, Alexander handed his physician the letter and calmly drank the medicine. A stunning psychological gamble. Winning his absolute gamble with death, Alexander restored the army's ferocious fighting spirit. The greatest hunt in human history had just begun. Deep within the opulent halls of Babylon, the sleeping giant finally awoke. Emperor Darius personally mobilized 100,000 men. Darius didn't just mobilize an army, he summoned an apocalyptic storm. 100,000 men marched westward for absolute revenge. Pulling the entire royal court behind him, the colossal Persian juggernaut marched into Syria, setting an open field trap at Sochoi. But Alexander refused the bait. To protect his vulnerable southern flank, he ordered General Parmenion to heavily fortify the Belen Pass.
We must strike through this pass. They will not expect us here. The risk is great, but we move.
My Emperor, the terrain is too narrow. We will completely surrender our numerical advantage. Out of my sight!
Ignoring brilliant tactical advice to divide his forces, the deeply offended Emperor Darius arrogantly ordered his best general to be executed. A fatal game of blind geometry began. Alexander and Darius marched in completely opposite directions, separated only by solid rock.
Nature itself swallowed the battlefield. A massive, freezing thunderstorm completely enveloped the jagged mountain peaks in total darkness. The Macedonians pushed aggressively south through the freezing coastal storm. Darius was slipping quietly behind Alexander's back, entirely unseen. Blinded by the fierce autumn storm, the Macedonian scouts saw absolutely nothing. Alexander's army had lost all tactical visibility.
Emerging from the mountain passes, Emperor Darius descended upon the coastal town of Issus, bypassing Alexander entirely. The Persians stumbled directly into Alexander's undefended field hospital, packed tightly with sick and severely wounded Macedonian soldiers. What followed was a psychological slaughter of unspeakable cruelty. Darius ordered his men to butcher the helpless patients without mercy. To send a terrifying message, the emperor brutally amputated the right hands of the survivors, leaving them in the mud. Released back into the storm, the mutilated survivors crawled south. They desperately sought Alexander's vanguard to deliver the horrifying news. Seeing his butchered men, Alexander realized the impossible truth. The massive Persian Empire was physically trapped directly behind him.
The king erupted in a feral rage. He didn't panic. He ordered the entire Macedonian war machine to instantly reverse direction. Raise the banners.
Raise the banners! Turn the army around! Turn the army around! We march back into the storm!
Forced to turn around, the entire Greek army marched relentlessly backward through the stormy darkness of midnight. Marching with terrifying speed, Alexander rushed to seal the narrow choke point. He would trap the emperor in a deadly bottleneck. Darius was cornered. Forced to fight on a narrow coastal strip, he had instantly surrendered his massive numerical advantage. General Charidemus warned Darius about the narrow terrain. The deeply offended emperor arrogantly ordered his best advisor executed. Trapped by his own strategic blunder, Darius turned the muddy river into a barricade. The apocalyptic storm was ready to break. Midday, before the bloodbath, the board was set. 40,000 Macedonians faced 100,000 Persians across the muddy river. The heavy phalanx anchored the Macedonian center. Alexander ordered Parmenion to hold the vulnerable left flank by the sea at all costs. On the rugged right flank, Alexander personally commanded the elite companion cavalry. The deadly hammer was positioned to strike the fatal blow. Emperor Darius massed his invincible heavy cavalry by the ocean, while 30,000 Greek mercenaries formed an unbreakable shield in the center. The narrow geography completely cancelled the Persian numerical advantage. Now, the fate of the ancient world rested on pure, brutal kinetic force.
Late afternoon, November 333 BC. The ultimate fate of two ancient empires was violently squeezed between towering cliffs and a roaring ocean. To survive a terrifying storm of Persian arrows, the heavy Macedonian phalanx launched a frantic, explosive sprint straight into the freezing river. Near the beach, a colossal wave of Persian heavy cavalry crashed across the water, dropping a terrifying physical weight onto Parmenion's defensive left flank. But the steep, slippery riverbed shattered the invincible Macedonian spear wall. Sensing blood, heavily armored Greek mercenaries poured down the banks to exploit the gaps. In the center, an absolute infantry bloodbath erupted. 120 elite Macedonian officers were slaughtered in the churning mud. The line buckled.
Alexander saw his phalanx dying. His companion cavalry executed a fatal sweeping wheel maneuver, striking directly into the Persian infantry's exposed ribs. Carving a brutal path straight through the elite Persian royal guards, Alexander charged directly at the golden chariot of Emperor Darius. Auxerthres, the royal brother, sacrificed his own life, throwing himself in front of the chariot to block the fatal strike and protect Darius. But staring directly at Alexander's blood-stained spear point, the Lord of Asia completely panicked. The Emperor of Emperors lost his nerve. Darius turned his chariot and fled the battlefield like a coward. Seeing their god-king run, the entire Asian war machine instantly shattered. A catastrophic mechanical blunder. the invincible Persian army broke in absolute terror, funneling blindly into the narrow, inescapable mountain choke points.
The invincible Persian army broke in absolute terror. Fleeing their emperor, they funneled blindly into the treacherous mountains. Trapped in the narrow, jagged ravines, tens of thousands mercilessly trampled each other to death trying to escape. Abandoned by Darius, his entire royal family was captured. Terrified, the Queen Mother mistakenly knelt before the taller commander, Hephaestion.
Do not be alarmed, Mother. You made no mistake. He too is Alexander.
Alexander replied to Darius's desperate plea for peace with a devastating letter that shattered the ancient world order. Come to me as the Lord of Asia. Never write to me as an equal. Address me as your master.
No border will limit my empire. I will conquer it all.
The coastal campaign violently resumed. Byblos and Sidon surrendered immediately. Stripped of its bases, the massive Persian fleet simply disintegrated. Issus left an eternal, brutal lesson. True authority is not measured by sheer numbers, but forged by the iron will of a single man. But far away in Babylon, the humiliated emperor refused to surrender. His terror mutated into an absolute apocalyptic rage. He began engineering a massive killing field at Gaugamela. The final apocalyptic bloodbath awaits. Subscribe to step onto the ultimate battlefield.